Hello, this is the second part of my presentation around child protection and safeguarding. So we've dealt with disclosures and a number of other things. One area that specifically needs raising is that around radicalisation and the prevent duty. So in 2015, a duty was placed on all schools by government to prevent people from being drawn into terrorism. This was quite controversial in some spheres, but it's important that we recognise that actually this is just a furthering of our child protection responsibilities. It's not about criminalisation or about criminal investigation. It's about recognising that radicalisation occurs with vulnerable young people, and we have a responsibility to try and protect them from that. So this graphic is meant to illustrate that idea that whilst radicalisation we often think of as being a criminal activity, only a very small part of that sits in a criminal sphere, and actually the non-criminal space is where our children often sit. Those children are often disillusioned and disaffected for lots of different reasons, and through a range of normal or relatively normal social processes they can be drawn into radicalisation. We have had issues around this within our school. Fewer than in many schools, but one or two. And actually in our specific situation, this is related to some far-right behaviours and far-right politics. I know often that the profile around this sits with the idea of Islamic radicalisation, and certainly that is a concern, but there are a number of different areas where this can be concerning, but it's worth recognising, or important actually, that we recognise all the time that the young people who fall into these areas are operating in a space where we would apply child protection principles to what we are doing. Now, there are a number of things that you might specifically think about. It's important that we realise what I've just said means that all of those signs and indicators we've already talked about are relevant in this situation. But there are three more specific areas that we might also think about. One is physical appearance, and in particular any changes that we've started to see in the physical appearance of young people, often in how they dress. In our school we have a very robust uniform policy, which means that sometimes dress is less of an issue, but certainly any symbols or badges that people may choose to wear, particular haircuts, growth of facial hair among some of the young men, a number of things that can be indicators that there should be concerns, although, as we say, taken on their own, they're often not. Hygiene is an issue occasionally, and in particular when we start to see changes around hygiene and dress, where young people are not necessarily taking the care they would usually, and that's often an indicator that they are more concerned around other issues rather than how they are presenting physically. I mentioned tattoos and symbols there. Not a huge issue with young people as far as the tattoos that we see, but it does occasionally occur. The examples I've given there, 18, 8 and 14, specifically refer to some of those far-right ideologies that I've mentioned. They refer actually to the letters of the alphabet that they are related to. So 18 would be AH for Adolf Hitler. That's one example of some of the tattoos that maybe you would see and would be concerning. Perhaps something that's more relevant in the school setting are some of these aspects of issues being verbalised. So young people who become particularly dogmatic in their views, not prepared to listen to people in lessons or share sensibly how they feel about things, people who shout down other kids because they don't agree with what they're saying, those are concerns, particularly if there's a coupled with sort of aggressive ways of dealing with people, or people becoming non-compliant. And again, that aspect of change is really important. And as I've said in my previous video, in order to recognise changes in the behaviours of young people, we would obviously need to recognise what the norm would be for that young person at any given time. People becoming emotionally volatile and us seeing changes within their behaviour as well would of course be concerning. As I've mentioned, we would treat these concerns in the same way that we would a concern around child protection issues of another sort. That information needs to be shared with myself or a member of the designated team, and we would go through the process of looking at other information that we had, sharing with other agencies if need be, speaking to the young person or their families. The model that's in play around radicalisation is what's called a push-pull model, where there are factors pushing children one way. So disaffection, lack of friendships, frustration with school or things that are happening in their lives. And on the alternate side, you have that pull of potentially new friendships, some kind of meaning to what they're doing, an attractive ideology. And those two things combined can be really concerning. That process is undertaken through normal social processes. So essentially it's a grooming model where slightly older young people or young adults would befriend or support those children in certain situations. Sometimes that occurs just while socialising, whether that be in their setting that they visit, them in some cases the mosque, sometimes down at the local football match, whatever it might be, depending on the sort of the model that we're talking about. But the point is, these are not abnormal situations where suddenly a criminal aspect is introduced to the life of that young person. They are drawn into that through normal social processes. Remember, this is about vulnerability, not criminality. It's a child protection model. For the last part of my presentation, I'd just like to go through in a little bit more detail some of the things that are in the document that I've shared around safe working practice and wider safeguarding. So again, you should have the Leeds City Council document, and on various pages it covers some of these things that I do like to just draw attention to. Bear in mind that that document is written for all employees of Leeds City Council and relates to lots of people doing lots of different roles, not all specific to schools. So, for example, one of the things talks about acceptance of gifts. Clearly, that's of huge concern if you're an elected member for the council. Perhaps less concerning if one of the children wants to share some chocolate in your lesson. But we do need to understand that many of those things apply absolutely to us in the schools as well. So there's a few things just to pick up on. In the code of conduct, we talk a little about staff dress and appearance and the expectations around that. And those are fairly self-explanatory. I've mentioned confidentiality, propriety and behaviour. Now, again, this is something that is about taking those expectations of us in our role seriously. It's not my place to tell people how to behave outside of school necessarily, but we do need to remember that we're in a respected role and that we are expected, therefore, to behave appropriately and with propriety at all times. That leads on to this idea of social contact, which can be a difficult thing to deal with in what is a community school. So I know within our school we have numerous members of staff who either have children who attend the school or are friendly with families who have children who attend the school, some who even play sport and the like at the same clubs as many of our children. In that context, it would be a nonsense to try and ban social contact. What it actually talks about in the Safe Working Practice Guidance and the expectations across all the literature that's relevant is that it would be inappropriate for adults in a school setting to seek social contact with young people. And I think there's an important difference there. So if you have any concerns about a situation where you might feel that there's going to be social contact and you are worried that that might be deemed inappropriate, please have a conversation with me. I suspect that it would not be, but it's an important and subtle point there about seeking social contact. If you happen to live in our community and see children out and about, there is nothing inappropriate in that. But if you are concerned, as I say, have a conversation. Now, physical contact is an important concern to lots of adults in schools, and they worry about where they stand around that. And what actually guidance talks about is physical contact not being needed or necessary, and limiting the touch that we have. So we have a limited touch model. There are times where it is necessary to have physical contact with children, and that's entirely appropriate, and there's no reason for that to be concerning. But actually we do need to consider whether there's a need to have that physical contact. I know many people operate in different ways in how they greet children. I've seen people high-fiving kids and various other things, and it would be churlish to say that that's always inappropriate, but there are times, of course, where it's not appropriate, and seeking physical contact is one of the key parts of the grooming model that is undertaken by people who are seeking to groom children as well. And so there's also, that to consider. So the rule of thumb is that we have limited physical contact with children, and only where necessary would we do that. But it is important that we recognise that where we feel that is necessary, whether it be to safeguard that child or another young person, to stop them from committing a dangerous act or a criminal act, or actually if their behaviour is prejudicial to the good order around the school, there are times where it's entirely appropriate for that physical contact to take place. Care, control and physical intervention are things that we don't, as I've mentioned, need to often undertake in our school, but there are expectations around that, and actually within our PD system, if there's a need to physically intervene with children, it would almost inevitably be after a phase 5 has been called, and it would be myself or another member of the senior leadership team who would direct that situation. One-to-one situations, we do run private detentions as part of our PD system, and of course we do work with individuals often for catch-up, for mentoring, for revision. Again, it's important just that you think practically around that. We wouldn't run a one-to-one situation in a closed office with no windows, for example. That puts that child at risk, and actually puts yourself at risk as a professional as well. So we would perhaps open the door if we're concerned that there's nobody else around. Inform a colleague possibly that you're working one-to-one with a child, or work in a fairly open and obvious area. So those are things to consider. The school does have a specific policy around internet use that I would encourage you to view. It covers a whole myriad of things about the appropriateness of data sharing and the like, which is partly relevant to this. But with regard to school and to child protection and safeguarding aspects, we do run a broad range of filtering systems that pick up inappropriate searches and a range of other things, and clearly we do need to be responsible in our internet use, and if we are using devices that are school devices, we need to consider what we're using them for also. I would encourage you to look at that policy as well. Some of the other things again may not be relevant to all of our roles, but things to consider. We are responsible for making sure we know the children in our care and any of their medical needs. That's information that is shared with you through the appropriate channels at the beginning of the year. There are rules and suggestions in that document around school trips, about swimming and a number of other things, but they are all things that generally the application of common sense would allow us to navigate. But I would encourage you to look through that document in detail just to make sure that you are aware of what's required of you in that. We are in a position of trust, just the last thing to draw upon there, and it's therefore important that we take these expectations seriously and do what we can to ensure that we're upholding those expectations at all times. So, responsibilities within that for you, then. You are responsible for your own actions and behaviour. By watching this video, or by producing this video and sharing the documentation that I've mentioned, I'm giving you the information that you require to conduct yourself within the school appropriately, and you're responsible for doing that. Always acting in the interests of the best interests of the child. If that's the case, then it's very difficult for your actions to be questioned. Avoiding conduct which would lead any reasonable person to question their motivations and intentions. I think that's a really important line, actually. I think if we take our responsibilities to young people seriously, and we're always acting to do the best we can for them, then it would be very difficult for reasonable people to question our motivations and intentions. An example of this, relatively recently, I had a colleague who had a young person break down in front of them, very distressed, very upset. It was a young girl, it was a female member of staff, and the girl was highly distressed, and at that point a member of staff felt it was appropriate to put their arm around them and comfort them in that way, in a corridor setting with lots of other people nearby, and was then concerned after the fact that they may have broken rules and be in trouble for that. We talked through this and looked at this particular piece of information, and I explained that in my view, and I think everybody's view, it would have been very difficult for any reasonable person to question the motivation in that situation, and it was an entirely appropriate act of kindness to a child. So it's important we recognise that in different circumstances that may have been questioned. Had, for example, I been putting my arm around that same child in an office setting with nobody else around, I think that would have been considered very different. And so, again, there are aspects of professional judgment and common sense which come into this, but that's really, that statement is a really important one. Just for as a side, it's important that we recognise we should not consume or be under the influence of alcohol or any substance which may affect our ability to care for children while we're doing so. Some information about power and positions of trust. So all adults working with children are in a position of trust, as I've mentioned. It's a really important statement that cannot be a relationship of equals. Staff must maintain clear professional and personal boundaries. Again, it's about taking our responsibilities seriously and making sure that we always do that, and not allowing those lines to become blurred. That doesn't mean we can't be friendly with children. It doesn't mean we can't develop relationships with children and connect with children, but it does mean that we maintain those professional boundaries at all times. There are specific things that we must not do. As it says there, we must not use our power to intimidate, threaten, demean, coerce or undermine pupils. Ours is not a school where you will regularly, if at all, see people delivering the hairdryer treatment to children. We have a very clear system of sanctions and rewards in our PD system. It can be delivered in a very low-key way and still maintain very high standards of behaviour in the school. We mustn't use our status to form or promote relationships or social contact. It goes to that point I mentioned around seeking social contact. Really important that that doesn't take place, as it says there, where it could be suggested that that position of trust was relevant to that friendship. The last few things to go through are some of those wider safeguarding things. Many of these I've already mentioned, just as a reminder. So attendance and registration is crucially important. So AM and PM registrations, and in every lesson we must know where our children are in order to keep them safe. Doing what we can through the curriculum to support the development and well-being of young people, again, extremely important. We are role models, and it's important therefore that we role model appropriate interactions with each other, with children, at all times, and that we show children how we should go about interacting and behaving. Duties which are organised by Mr. Rowbottom, our associate head teacher. These are crucially important as well. Children feel safe when staff are on duty. It's not just about supervising behaviours or cues, it's about the children feeling that they are safe and well, and that they'll be looked after if there are any concerns. I mentioned very briefly anti-bullying, and it comes into a number of other areas, and you'll hear information about our school ethos and our approach to this from my colleague Christopher. But again, it's something that we take seriously, and clearly if children feel safe from bullying, then we are doing a better job of safeguarding them. We are responsible for being vigilant around the site. As I mentioned earlier, we do have a not completely closed site, so it is possible for people to come on site, although they do rarely. And whilst I don't expect every member of staff to challenge anybody who's not there or to challenge any concerning situations within school, it's certainly the case that I would expect staff to raise concerns if they see somebody who's not appropriately identified with their badge and not in uniform. All sixth formers who are not in school uniform wear a badge, and it's important that we challenge them through the PD and Standards for Learning system if they're not wearing them. Anybody else who's on site without a member of staff there and without a visitor's badge should be challenged and directed to reception or a member of the senior leadership team called. So just to finish, we all have a duty of care to the young people in our school, and we should all do whatever we can to make sure that we protect them from physical and emotional harm. Thank you very much, and I look forward to working with you.